Only one rose arrived in town. He gave it to the woman no one expected, the only flower in winter. The train came late that morning, groaning into Silver Creek under a sky the color of cold tin. February had settled hard over the Rockies. Snow clung to rooftops in uneven sheets, and frost edged every window along Main Street. The town wasn't much: one trading post, a saloon, a blacksmith, a church with a bell that rang more out of habit than celebration. But on February 14th, even a place like Silver Creek allowed itself a little expectation. Deliveries from Denver were rare this time of year. The mountain pass closed without warning, and storms could bury the tracks overnight. So when word spread that the morning train carried something special, half the town drifted toward the trading post before noon. Inside, the potbelly stove radiated a tired warmth. Boots stamped against wooden floors. Coats shed melting snow. Mr. Abernathy, who ran the trading post, slit open a narrow crate with slow ceremony while a small crowd leaned forward. "What is it?" someone asked. "From Denver," he replied, as if that alone made it valuable. He peeled back the packing straw carefully, and then the room went still. Inside the crate lay a single red rose. Not silk, not pressed, not painted. Fresh. Velvet petals deep as wine. Stem wrapped in damp cloth. A fragile defiance against winter. A murmur rippled through the store. "Only one," Mrs. Grady whispered. "Freight must have frozen the rest," someone muttered. Valentine's Day in Silver Creek had never seen such extravagance. Roses didn't survive the climb to 9,000 feet in February. Not alive. Not like this. Mr. Abernathy lifted it gently, almost reverently. "Special order," he said. "Paid in full." And just like that, the question settled over the town like fresh snow. Who was it for? Eyes turned, subtle at first, then openly, toward Lillian Hart. She stood near the fabric counter, gloved hands resting against polished wood. Golden hair pinned perfectly. Blue dress trimmed in lace shipped all the way from St. Louis. Lillian had been Silver Creek's beauty since she stepped off a train 3 springs ago. Every dance, every picnic, every church gathering, men found reasons to stand near her. It made sense, didn't it? If there was only one rose in town, surely it would belong to the prettiest woman in it. Lillian smiled faintly, already accustomed to being expected. Across the room, near the back shelf where thread and needles were kept, another woman stood very still. Clara Bennett kept her gaze lowered. Her dress was simple gray wool, sleeves rolled slightly at the cuff where chalk dust lingered from marking hems. A few loose strands of brown hair had escaped her braid, but she made no effort to smooth them back. She had come for buttons. Nothing more. No one looked at her. No one ever did when there was something brighter in the room. The door creaked open again, letting in a blade of cold air. Conversation dipped. Boots stepped across the threshold, deliberate and unhurried. Daniel Carter didn't remove his hat right away. Snow clung to the brim. He stood just inside the doorway, scanning the room with steady eyes that missed little and revealed less. He wasn't the loudest man in town. He wasn't the wealthiest either. But when Daniel Carter walked into a room, the space seemed to measure itself differently. Rancher, war veteran, owner of the largest spread north of the ridge, a man who spoke rarely and paid his debts in full. His gaze fell to the rose in Mr. Abernathy's hand. Something unreadable moved across his expression. The crowd shifted, anticipation tightening like a drawn wire. "Well," the blacksmith chuckled, nudging the man beside him. "Looks like we know who ordered it." All eyes moved between Daniel and Lillian. Lillian lifted her chin just slightly. Not arrogance, just certainty. Daniel stepped forward. Each footfall sounded louder than it should have against the wooden floor. Mr. Abernathy cleared his throat. "Came in on your account, Carter." A flicker of surprise crossed a few faces. So it was true. Daniel removed his gloves slowly. "Yes," he said. "Just that. Yes." The rose waited between them, impossibly red against winter light filtering through the window. And across the room, Clara told herself not to look up, because hope, she had learned, was a dangerous thing in small towns. Daniel reached for the rose. The entire trading post held its breath. And just before he turned, Clara's fingers tightened around the small paper package of buttons in her hand. The turn no one saw coming, Daniel Carter took the rose from Mr. Abernathy's hand. For a moment, he simply held it. The red looked almost unreal against his rough, weathered fingers. hands built for reins and barbed wire, not delicate stems. The trading post had gone so quiet that the ticking of the wall clock near the sugar barrels sounded like hammer strikes. Lillian's smile deepened just slightly. Not smug. Assured. She had worn blue today on purpose. Valentine's blue. The shade that made her eyes look brighter in winter light. Half the town had noticed when she walked in. She was accustomed to entrances. Accustomed to outcomes. Daniel turned. Every head shifted with him. He took one step. Toward Lillian. A murmur rippled through the room. Second step. Closer now. Lillian lifted her chin, graceful as ever, hands folding loosely at her waist. Someone near the stove whispered, "About time." The blacksmith grinned openly. Daniel stopped. One pace short of her. The rose rested steady in his hand. Lillian's breath caught, barely visible, but there. Daniel's eyes met hers. Polite. Calm. Unreadable. Then he kept walking. The movement was so simple it took a second to register. Boots against wood. One step past her shoulder. Then another. The lace at Lillian's sleeve brushed the air where he had been expected to stop. A sharp silence cracked through the room. Daniel did not look back. He walked past the fabric counter, past the stove, past the row of curious faces that had already begun reshaping the story in their minds, and stopped at the back shelf, where Clara Bennett stood frozen. Her fingers tightened around the paper-wrapped buttons until the edges bent. She hadn't moved, hadn't breathed, hadn't allowed herself the cruelty of imagining this. Daniel stood before her now, close enough that she could see a thin scar along his jaw she'd never noticed before. Snow still clung to the shoulders of his coat, melting slowly onto the floorboards. The trading post felt suddenly too small to contain what was happening. Clara lifted her eyes at last. Not wide, not hopeful. Cautious. Daniel looked at her the way a man looks at something he has already decided on. Not impulsively, not publicly, but fully. "I believe this is yours," he said. His voice was low, steady, not loud enough to command the room. Yet somehow everyone heard it. Clara blinked once. Her voice nearly failed her, but she caught it. "I don't think. You mended my winter coat," Daniel continued evenly. "When the lining tore during that first storm." A flicker of recognition passed through her face. "That was nothing," she said softly. "Anyone would have. You stayed late," he corrected. "You didn't charge me." A faint flush rose to her cheeks. "It was just thread." Daniel glanced down at the rose in his hand. "Nothing that keeps a man warm through February is just thread." The words landed heavier than the petals looked. Behind them, someone shifted. A chair leg scraped. The blacksmith muttered something under his breath. Lillian remained very still at the front of the room. Daniel stepped closer. Close enough now that Clara could smell cold air and cedar on his coat. "I don't have a speech," he said quietly, so only she could truly hear. "And I don't know much about roses." A pause. "But I know who stood in the doorway during the blizzard and made sure the Carter Ranch hands had blankets." Clara swallowed. "That wasn't for you," she whispered. Daniel's gaze softened, just slightly. "I know." He held the rose out to her. Not dramatically, not like a performance. Simply offering. "For you, Clara." The room felt suspended between heartbeats. Clara stared at the flower as if it might vanish if she reached too quickly. No one had ever handed her something beautiful with the entire town watching. Her hand trembled. Only once, before she took it. The red against her gray sleeve was startling. Like color returning to something long muted. A collective breath released through the trading post. Not applause. Not approval. Just realization. Daniel nodded once, satisfied in a way that did not seek validation. Then he turned slightly, just enough for the room to see his face clearly. "If there's only one rose in Silver Creek," he said evenly, "it ought to go to the woman who keeps this town stitched together." No one laughed. No one argued. Because somewhere deep down, they knew it was true. Near the front of the store, Lillian lowered her eyes. Not wounded, not humiliated. Just confronted with something she had never needed to consider before. Worth, it seemed, did not always announce itself in lace. Daniel reached for his gloves again. "I'll be at the ranch," he said simply to Clara. "If you'd care to walk out this evening." Not a demand. Not a spectacle. An invitation. Then he stepped toward the door. The bell above it jingled as he pushed it. Open, winter sunlight pouring in behind him. Clara stood in the warm hush of the trading post, a single red rose in her hands. And for the first time in her life, she was the one the room had to look at. The night the storm broke, the trading post slowly returned to movement after Daniel left. Voices rose again, quieter now. Speculative. Careful. Clara remained where she stood, the rose still in her hands as if it were something fragile enough to bruise. She could feel eyes on her, but they no longer burned the way they used to. They were searching now, recalculating. Mrs. Grady approached first. "Well," she said softly, not unkindly. "I suppose winter sees things summer misses." Clara managed a small nod. But her thoughts were no longer in the trading post. They had drifted backward. To January. To the night the storm broke the ridge. It had started before dusk, wind screaming down from the peaks, sharp enough to cut breath short. By nightfall, snow came sideways, thick and blinding. The pass closed within an hour. Lanterns vanished behind white sheets. Clara had been alone in her small room above the tailor shop when the first knock came at the door below. Hard. Urgent. She hadn't meant to answer it. But Mr. Abernathy had already shuttered the trading post, and most folks had bolted themselves in for the night. When she opened the downstairs door, the wind nearly tore it from her hands. Daniel Carter stood there, snow driven deep into the collar of his coat. "Need blankets," he said, voice tight against the gale. "Two of my hands got caught near Miller's Bend. They won't make the climb back without cover." She didn't hesitate. Not then. She gathered every spare quilt she had mended for spring trade. Wool throws meant for sale. Even the thick patchwork she kept folded at the foot of her own bed. "You'll never reach the ranch in this," she said. "We'll try." That was Daniel. Always we. Even when he carried the weight alone. She stepped into the storm beside him. No one in town saw. No one would have approved. They walked half a mile before the wind made it impossible to see 10 feet ahead. Snow stung like thrown sand. The drifts were already knee-high. When they found the two ranch hands, they were huddled behind a broken fence. Post, faces pale, hands numb. Clara knelt first. She wrapped the youngest in her own coat before Daniel could protest. Her fingers worked quickly, firm and certain, tucking wool tight around frozen shoulders. "Stay awake," she told the boy. "Talk to me." Daniel watched her then, not as a rancher accepting help, but as a man seeing something steady in chaos. It took nearly an hour to move them back toward town. At one point, the wind shifted violently, knocking Clara sideways into a drift. Daniel caught her before she disappeared beneath it, his hand at her waist. Strong. Immediate. For a split second they stood too close, snow whipping around them, breath mingling in white clouds. "You shouldn't have come," he said roughly. "You shouldn't have asked," she replied. But neither let go. They reached the boarding house near midnight. The ranch hand survived. Clara never mentioned it again. Neither did Daniel. In town, the story became about Carter's strength, his endurance, his leadership in the storm. No one spoke of the quiet woman who walked beside him. But Daniel remembered. He remembered how she didn't ask who would see her, didn't weigh reputation against need. He remembered the way she had pressed warmth back into freezing hands as if it were the simplest task in the world. And later that night, when he returned alone to the ranch, he had stood in his barn doorway and realized something unsettled him more than the storm. He had looked for her first when the wind howled. Back in the trading post, Clara turned the rose slowly between her fingers. Now she understood. It hadn't been about today. It had been about January. About a night no one else witnessed. About a woman who stepped into the storm without waiting to be chosen. Outside, the afternoon light had begun to soften. And somewhere beyond town limits, at the Carter Ranch, Daniel was waiting. Not for applause, not for approval, but for her. Where the light falls softest, Clara waited until the sun began to lower before leaving town. Not because she doubted, but because some moments deserved the right light. The road to the Carter Ranch stretched long and pale beneath the fading afternoon sky. Snow along the edges had begun to soften, dripping steadily where golden light touched it. The air held that fragile warmth that comes just before evening claims it back. She carried the rose carefully, wrapped in brown paper to shield it from the wind. The ranch house appeared gradually beyond the rise, broad-shouldered and steady against the slope. Smoke lifted in a thin line from the chimney. Daniel was outside when she arrived, not waiting at the fence, not pacing, simply repairing a loose board near the corral, sleeves rolled, movements unhurried. He looked up before she called his name, as if he had known. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet here was different from town quiet. It did not press. It opened. "You came," he said. It wasn't surprise. It was acknowledgement. Clara stepped closer, boots soft against thawing ground. You asked. A faint curve touched his mouth, small, but real. He set the hammer aside. The sky behind him stretched wide, streaked with amber and pale rose, the mountains holding the last of the light along their ridges. I wasn't certain you would, he admitted. Clara tilted her head slightly. You faced down half the town this morning. Daniel shook his head once. That wasn't facing them. His gaze settled on her, steady. That was choosing. The distinction lingered between them. She unwrapped the rose slowly. Even in the cooling air, it remained impossibly red. I've never had one before, she said quietly. Daniel's brow furrowed. That surprises me. It shouldn't. He didn't argue. Instead, he gestured toward the porch. Walk with me. They moved side by side along the fence line, boots brushing against dry winter grass. The cattle had settled, low murmurs rising occasionally from the barn. The world felt suspended in that thin place between day and night. After a few steps, Daniel spoke again. I nearly didn't order it. Clara glanced at him. Why? I don't favor spectacles. I noticed. A breath of laughter escaped him, soft, almost unused. He grew quiet again before continuing. I thought about that night in January. The storm. His jaw shifted slightly, remembering. You didn't hesitate. It wasn't mine to hesitate over. It was dangerous. So was doing nothing. He looked at her then, fully. The last of the sunlight touched her face, warming it in soft gold. For the first time, he allowed himself to study her without the weight of witnesses. I've seen men freeze because they waited for someone else to move, he said quietly. You didn't wait. Clara held his gaze. Neither did you. A long silence followed. Not empty. Full. Daniel reached out slowly, not abruptly, not claiming, just brushing his fingers lightly against the edge of her sleeve. Most people see what shines first, he said. It's easier. Clara's breath caught, but she did not step back. And you? She asked. I notice what holds. The words were simple, but they settled deep. The wind shifted gently, carrying the faint scent of cedar and distant snowmelt. Somewhere behind them, a horse shifted in its stall. Clara looked down at the rose, then back at him. I don't want to be chosen because there was only one flower, she said softly. Daniel's hand fell away, not in retreat, but in respect. You weren't, he answered. The certainty in his voice left no space for doubt. I ordered one, he continued. Because one is enough when you know exactly where it belongs. The light dimmed another shade, evening settling in earnest now. Clara stepped closer, close enough that she could see the faint flecks of lighter brown in his eyes. This town, she said carefully, will talk. Let it. They will measure. I don't live by their ruler. A pause. Then, gently, do you? She shook her head. For the first time, the distance between them felt chosen rather than cautious. Daniel lifted his hand again, slower this time, giving her every chance to turn away. She didn't. His fingers brushed hers, calloused against careful skin. Warm. Real. No audience. No applause. Just the steady rhythm of two breaths finding the same pace. The mountains darkened into silhouette around them, the first evening star appearing overhead. I don't have lace, Clara said softly, almost teasing. Daniel's thumb traced lightly along her knuckles. I don't need lace. She smiled then, fully this time. And in that quiet stretch of land high above Silver Creek, with frost beginning to gather again at the edges of shadow, they stood not as spectacle or surprise, but as two people who had already weathered a storm together. The rose between them no longer felt fragile. It felt certain. The kind of future that's built, not promised. The last of the daylight slipped behind the ridge, leaving the ranch wrapped in a deepening blue. A lantern burned low near the barn door, its glow steady against the cooling air. Clara and Daniel still stood near the fence line, their hands no longer uncertain, but not yet intertwined either. Close enough to feel warmth, careful enough to honor it. Daniel was the first to speak. I've been thinking about spring. Clara glanced up at him. Spring. He nodded slightly. Fence posts need replacing along the west pasture. Ground softens enough by April to set them right. He paused, then added, it's the kind of work that takes time. Can't rush it, or they lean by summer. She understood he wasn't only talking about fences. And you plan ahead that far? She asked gently. I try to. His gaze drifted toward the open fields, silvered now by moonlight. A ranch doesn't survive on good intentions. It survives on what's tended every day. Clara felt the weight beneath his words. I won't ask you for something grand, Daniel continued. No sudden vows. No pressure wrapped in pretty language. He looked back at her, steady and unflinching. I don't believe in building a life on the heat of a single evening. The wind moved lightly between them, quieter now. What do you believe in? She asked. Daniel took a slow breath. I believe in mornings. His voice lowered, thoughtful. In shared coffee before the sun clears the ridge. In knowing who's walking beside you when winter comes back around. In choosing the same person when it's ordinary. When it's hard. Clara's throat tightened, but she did not look away. I've lived long enough, he said carefully, to know that loneliness doesn't always come from being alone. Sometimes it comes from standing next to someone who isn't staying. Her fingers shifted slightly, brushing his again. And you would stay? She asked. Daniel did not answer quickly. He considered it, the way he would consider a land purchase or a breeding pair, seriously, without romance clouding judgment. Yes, he said at last. But not because I'm afraid of losing you. His eyes held hers. Because I respect you. The words settled between them like something solid. I want a future that grows, he continued. Slow. Honest. Where you don't disappear into my shadow, and I don't ask you to. A faint crease formed at the corner of his eyes. You have your own spine. I won't bend it. Clara felt something inside her ease, something she hadn't realized she had been guarding. And if the town keeps watching, she asked softly. They will. His answer was simple. But they tire. People always do. Especially when there's nothing scandalous left to feed on. A small smile touched her lips. And what would this future look like? She pressed. Daniel stepped closer, not to overwhelm, but to speak plainly. You'd keep your work if you wanted. Or not. We'd mend what needs mending. Share the table. Argue when necessary. A faint hint of warmth entered his tone. I suspect you would argue well. I would, she admitted. I know. Silence returned, but it no longer felt fragile. I'm not asking you to marry me, Daniel said at last, voice firm but gentle. Not tonight. Not because a rose bloomed in winter. His thumb brushed lightly against the edge of her knuckles again. I'm asking if you'd be willing to see what we build by spring. The honesty of it struck deeper than any dramatic declaration could have. No kneeling. No spectacle. Just intention. Clara searched his face for impatience and found none. For urgency and found none. Only steadiness. I don't want to be rescued, she said quietly. I don't want to rescue you, he replied. I want to stand beside you. The words were not loud, but they carried. Clara exhaled slowly, the breath visible between them in the cooling air. Then we begin with spring, she said. Daniel nodded once, as if sealing an agreement between equals. Spring, he echoed. He did not pull her closer. He did not claim more than she offered. Instead, he lifted the lantern from the post and held it between them, its warm light casting both their shadows long across the frost-tipped ground, two figures distinct, but walking the same direction. And under the vast Montana sky, where stars gathered without hurry, their future did not feel like a leap. It felt like something planted. The question asked without spectacle. Spring did not arrive all at once. It came in softened ground and longer light, in the slow drip of thaw from the barn roof and the first green threading through fields that had seemed permanently asleep. By late March, the west pasture fence post stood newly set, firm in the earth, just as Daniel had promised. Clara had been there the day he finished the last one, not watching idly, working. Her gloves were dusted with soil, her sleeves rolled in a way the town would have once whispered about. Now, fewer people whispered. And when they did, it carried less certainty. The ranch had settled into a rhythm that felt neither forced nor fragile. Mornings began with coffee shared at the small kitchen table, steam rising between them as sunlight spilled across worn floorboards. Evenings ended with quiet conversation, sometimes laughter, sometimes silence that did not need filling. Nothing dramatic. Everything deliberate. On a mild afternoon, with the sky stretched wide and blue over Montana, Daniel asked Clara to walk the North Ridge with him. It wasn't unusual. They often walked the property line to check for breaks or drifting cattle. But today he carried no tools. Half a mile from the house, they stopped where the land dipped gently toward the creek. Snowmelt ran clear and steady, catching light like scattered glass. Meadowlarks had begun testing their voices in the distance. Clara rested her hands loosely in front of her. You're quiet, she observed. Daniel nodded once. I am. He removed his hat, running a hand briefly through wind-pressed hair, then replaced it. I've been measuring things, he said. She tilted her head. Fence lines again? No, his gaze settled fully on her. Time. The breeze moved softly around them. I said I wanted to see what we built by spring, he continued. Spring is here. Clara felt her pulse steady, not racing, not fearful, just aware. Daniel stepped closer, boots firm against the thawed earth. I don't believe in rushing, he said, and I don't believe in speaking before I'm certain. His voice remained calm, but there was weight beneath it. I'm certain now. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat, not for a velvet box, not for anything polished. Instead, he drew out something small wrapped in plain cloth. My mother wore this, he said quietly as he unfolded it. Inside lay a simple gold band. No stones, no engraving, the metal worn smooth with years. She used to say a ring shouldn't outshine the hand that wears it. Clara's breath caught softly. Daniel did not kneel immediately. He stood in front of her, looking at her as an equal, not a prize. I won't promise you ease, he said. This land isn't easy. Neither am I. A faint, honest curve touched his mouth. But I will promise steadiness. He finally lowered himself to one knee, not abrupt, not theatrical, just grounded. I will wake beside you and choose you when the sky is clear and when it isn't. I will argue fair. I will listen. I will stand beside you in town and in storms. His eyes did not waver. And I will never ask you to be smaller, so I can feel larger. The creek moved behind them, steady and unhurried. Clara Whitmore, he said, her name carried by open air rather than witnesses. Will you marry me? Not because winter was lonely, not because spring feels hopeful, but because we have already proven we can stand. There were no church bells, no gathered crowd, just meadowlarks and wind. Clara stepped closer, close enough that the shadow of his hat brushed her skirt. She looked at the ring, not as ornament, but as history. You didn't ask to rescue me, she said softly. No, you didn't ask for gratitude. No, you asked to build. Yes. Her smile came slowly, like sunrise over ridge lines. Then yes, she answered. I will marry you. Daniel rose carefully, as if the moment itself required steady hands. He slid the ring onto her finger. It fit, not perfectly, but close enough to feel meant. He did not lift her off the ground. He did not spin her in celebration. Instead, he placed his forehead gently against hers, eyes closed, breath shared. The kind of closeness earned, the kind of promise measured. And beneath the vast Montana sky, with the creek running clear and the fence posts set firm behind them, their future did not feel like a grand declaration. It felt like something already rooted. The wedding was small, not because they lacked invitation, but because they preferred it that way. It took place in late May, when the Montana sky stretched wide and clear, and the last stubborn traces of winter had finally surrendered to green hills and open air. The ceremony stood beneath a cottonwood tree near the creek, its leaves whispering softly in the afternoon breeze. The town came, not all at once, not loudly, but they came. Men who once lowered their voices when Clara passed now removed their hats without hesitation. Women who had measured her in silence now offered simple nods that held no calculation. Time had done its work. So had example. Daniel stood steady in a dark coat brushed clean for the day. Clara wore a dress of pale cream. No lace, no extravagance, stitched partly by her own careful hands. The gold band rested on her finger, warmed now by weeks of wear. When they spoke their vows, there was no trembling, only clarity. I will walk with you, Daniel said. I will remain, Clara answered. No promises of forever shouted into the wind. Just words built to last because they were plain. Afterward, the town shared lemonade and bread near the ridge. Children ran along the creek's edge. Laughter rose easily, unforced. At some quiet point before dusk, Daniel and Clara stepped away. They climbed the same north ridge where he had once knelt with his mother's ring in his palm. The pasture below stretched gold beneath lowering sunlight, fence posts standing straight, the ranch house solid against the horizon. Clara slipped her hand into his. Do you remember, she said softly, the night of the storm? I do. I thought I would always be the woman at the corner table. Daniel looked at her, not with pity, but with recognition. You were never that, he said. She smiled faintly. The town thought so. The town thinks many things. She studied the land below, the house, the barn, the open miles beyond. And now, Daniel followed her gaze. Now, he said quietly, they see what was always there. The sun lowered further, washing the fields in amber light. Meadowlarks called across the valley. Somewhere below, smoke lifted gently from the chimney as someone prepared supper. Their home. Not loud, not grand, but chosen. Daniel turned toward her fully. There were no speeches left to make. No grand declarations remaining. Everything that needed saying had already been proven in frost and thaw, in shared mornings and steady presence. He brushed a loose strand of hair from her cheek. Spring came, he said. Yes, Clara answered. And we built. She nodded. They stood together as the first evening star appeared overhead. Just as it had the night he first told her he believed in mornings. Below them, the town of Black Pine Creek glowed softly in the fading light. Doors closed properly now. Windows held warmth. People moved differently, subtly changed by witnessing something steady instead of spectacular. The rose he had once given her was long pressed between pages of a small Bible beside their bed. Its petals faded. Its meaning didn't. The wind moved gently across the ridge, no longer sharp with winter, no longer heavy with doubt. Clara leaned into him, not from need, but from choice. And as the sky deepened into indigo over Montana territory, there was no applause, no dramatic swell, only the quiet certainty of two lives aligned. The kind of ending that does not announce itself, the kind that simply stays. And beneath a sky vast enough to hold every season that would come, Daniel Carter and Clara Whitmore stood side by side, no longer watched, no longer measured, just living the promise they had built, one steady day at a time.